I found out my children had sold my cemetery plot when a stranger called to ask why his mother's name was being placed beside my wife's grave. At first, I thought it was a mistake. And then the cemetery office sent me the transfer form, and there it was, my name written in a signature that looked almost like mine, giving away the resting place I had bought 31 years earlier, so I could be buried beside the woman who had carried my whole life in her hands. My wife, Clara, had been in the ground for 6 years, and I still brought her yellow tulips every Friday. I still cleaned the grass around her stone with my own pocket knife, and while I was doing that, my son and daughter had quietly sold the empty plot beside her to cover a business debt. They thought I knew nothing about. They did not call me. They did not ask me. They did not even leave me the dignity of being dead in the right place. And so I sat at my kitchen table, held the forged transfer form under the light, and decided I would not raise my voice. I would raise paperwork. My name is Samuel Whitmore. I am 76 years old. And for 48 years I was Clara's husband before I was anything else in Akron, Ohio. People knew me as a tool and die man, the kind of worker who could read metal the way some men read weather. I started at Brenner Machine Works when I was 19, sweeping floors and carrying coffee for men who had fingers missing and stories they never told twice. By 30, I was running a line. By 50, I was training younger men who thought computers had replaced patience. They had not. A machine could cut steel. It could not teach a man care. Clara was the care in our house. And she taught second grade for 32 years. She had a voice that could calm a crying child, correct a rude adult, and make me feel forgiven before I had even apologized. She kept our home warm in ways that had nothing to do with the furnace. And she made soup when neighbors were sick. She remembered birthdays nobody else remembered. She saved every drawing our children made and labeled the back with the date. And as if every crooked son and stick-figure family was evidence that our life mattered. We had 2 children, Russell and Diane. Russell was our first, loud, handsome, full of plans, and always convinced the next thing would make him rich, if only someone else could help him reach it. Diane came 3 years later, sharper in school, softer with strangers, but always afraid of being left behind. And Clara and I loved them without strategy. That is how parents are when they are young. You pour everything out and assume love will teach gratitude on its own. It does not always. And we paid for Russell's trade school after he dropped out of college and said he needed a practical start. I worked overtime until my hands locked at night. And we paid for Diana's nursing program after she said she wanted a stable life and needed one chance to prove herself. Clara tutored children in the summer to help cover books when Russell's first marriage collapsed. And he moved into our basement with 2 duffel bags and a truck payment he could not make. When Diana's husband Craig lost his job during the recession, and Clara and I quietly paid their mortgage for 4 months and never told the grandchildren why Christmas was smaller that year. That was how we lived. We did not keep score. We kept family. And the cemetery plots came from Clara's idea. We bought them when we were in our mid-40s, which felt absurd at the time. I remember standing at Willow Rest Cemetery on a windy April afternoon and looking at 2 rectangles of grass near a maple tree and telling her we were too young to be shopping for death. Clara only squeezed my hand and said practical things were less frightening when done together. And she chose Section B, Row 12, plots 18 and 19, because the maple turned gold in October, and because from that spot you could see the small chapel roof over the hill. Plot 18 was hers, and Plot 19 was mine. We paid in full. I joked that it was the only real estate we owned with no mortgage, and Clara laughed so hard she had to wipe her eyes. After she died, that plot became more than land. And it became a promise still waiting for me. I knew some men moved on from grief by selling houses, changing churches, marrying again, or packing away photographs. I did not judge them. And every person survives loss in his own language. Mine was Friday mornings at Willow Rest, yellow tulips in one hand, a thermos of coffee in the other, speaking to a stone because silence in a cemetery felt less empty than silence at home. I told Clara everything there. I told her when the furnace broke. I told her when Diane forgot my birthday and called 2 days late. I told her when Russell wanted another loan. I told her when my knee hurt. I told her when the maple tree dropped leaves across her name and made the whole place look blessed. I told her I was tired but not ready. I told her I would see her when it was time. And I never imagined my children would sell the place where that time was meant to come. The first sign that Russell and Diane had changed did not come with cruelty. It came with impatience. After Clara died, they visited more often for about 3 months. Then life returned to them, as it always does for people standing outside center of grief. Russell came by when he needed my truck, my tools, or a check. Diane came by with casseroles she had bought from the grocery store and removed from the plastic container so they looked homemade. I accepted all of it because loneliness can make a man grateful for even badly performed care. And then they started talking about my future, as if I would not be included in it. Russell mentioned that the house was too much for one man. Diane said old neighborhoods were not as safe as they used to be. And Craig said there were excellent senior communities with shuttle buses and card rooms. Russell's second wife Marlene asked whether I had considered simplifying my assets. She said simplifying the way some people say surrender. I was old, not absent still. I listened, I did not argue. At 76, a man learns that people reveal more when they believe you have stopped paying attention. Russell and Diane had started a business together called Whitmore Home Renewal. It sounded respectable. They bought tired houses, renovated them quickly, and sold them to young families who liked gray floors and black kitchen fixtures. Russell handled contractors. Diane handled staging and paperwork. Craig managed advertising. Marlene posted videos online, walking through half-finished kitchens and talking about legacy, family values, and building wealth the right way. And the right way, in their case, often meant borrowing money and hoping the next deal solved the last one. At first, I was proud my children were working together. They were using the Whitmore name. They said Clara would have loved it. That sentence was still enough to open me. When they asked for a small loan to secure their first property, I gave it. When they needed help buying equipment, I helped. When a plumbing issue threatened their second flip, I covered the emergency because Russell promised the closing would repay me. It did not. He said the market shifted. Diane said everything was temporary. Craig said growth always looked messy in the middle. I had spent my life around machines. I knew the difference between messy and failing, but I wanted them to succeed badly enough to distrust my own eyes. Then the questions changed. Russell asked where I kept the deed to my house. Diane asked if Clara had left any insurance money untouched. And Marlene asked whether my cemetery arrangements were prepaid because end-of-life planning could become expensive if delayed. Craig asked whether unused burial property could be transferred and sold or exchanged. He said it casually during Thanksgiving while cutting turkey on Clara's old platter. I remember the room going still inside me. I asked why he wanted to know. And Craig shrugged and said he had read an article about people wasting money on old plans that no longer fit modern families. Modern families. And that was the phrase people used when they wanted permission to discard what earlier generations had sacrificed to keep. I told him my arrangements were handled. I told him Clara and I had bought side-by-side plots at Willow Rest. And mine was not unused, it was waiting. Diane looked away. Russell stared at his plate. Marlene smiled too quickly and changed the subject to dessert. That night, after everyone left, I drove to Willow Rest and sat in my truck outside the cemetery gates. They were locked, but I could see the maple tree in the distance, bare against the winter sky. I felt foolish for worrying. And surely my children would not touch that. Surely even selfish people recognize some ground as sacred. I was wrong. The main insult happened 2 months before I found the transfer form. Russell and Diane came to my house on a rainy Saturday morning with Craig and Marlene behind them. That alone told me it was not a visit. It was a delegation. Russell carried a folder. Diane carried an expression that had already decided I was difficult. Marlene looked around the living room at Clara's quilts, old photographs, and the upright piano nobody played anymore, as if she were mentally tagging items for sale. Russell started gently. He said the business was in a tight spot, but nothing serious. Diane said a buyer had delayed closing on one of their properties, and a bridge payment would solve everything. Craig said banks were being unreasonable. Marlene said family wealth had to circulate if it was going to grow. I asked how much. Russell did not answer right away, and that was my first real answer. Diane finally said they needed $120,000 for 60 days. The number sat between us like a body. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because there was a time my children would have been embarrassed to ask for 20. Now they could ask for 6 figures and still act wounded if I hesitated. I told them I did not have that kind of loose cash. Russell said I had equity. Diane said I had savings. Craig said a short-term private note could be arranged. Marlene said Clara would not have wanted her children to lose everything, while I sat alone in a paid-off house waiting to die. And that was the first blade. I looked at her, then at my children, waiting for one of them to correct her. Neither did. Russell leaned forward and said I had to be realistic. Diane said nobody was trying to take anything from me. And Craig said there were assets that served no purpose anymore. Then Marlene, with that careful voice people use when cruelty is dressed as common sense, said the cemetery plot beside Clara was just a piece of grass until I was dead. And just a piece of grass. I felt the room tilt. Clara had chosen that piece of grass. Clara had stood under that maple tree and told me practical things were less frightening when done together. Clara had been lowered into the earth beside that empty space while I held Russell's arm because my knees nearly gave out every Friday for 6 years. I had stood there and kept my promise. And my daughter-in-law had reduced it to grass. I looked at Russell again. He rubbed his jaw. I looked at Diane. Her eyes were wet, but she said nothing. Silence has a sound when it abandons you. And it is louder than shouting. I told them no. The word surprised them. It surprised me too. Not because I had never said it, but because I had said it without apology. Russell's face hardened, and Diane began to cry, which had worked on me many times before. Craig stood and said I was letting sentiment ruin the family. Marlene said old people sometimes loved memories more than living children. Russell said, if Clara were here, she would help them. That was when I stood. I told them never to use their mother's name to pry open my wallet. No one spoke for a moment. Then Diane said something soft and terrible. And she said I was already living like half of me was in the ground, so maybe I should stop acting like the rest of them had to be buried with me. I did not yell. I did not tell them to leave. I only walked to the front door and opened it. Rain blew onto the porch. One by one, they stepped out, offended by the boundary as if it were a crime. After they drove away, I sat in Clara's chair and stared at the wall until dark. And I thought that was the worst they could do. I still had not seen the transfer form. The call came from a man named Alan Pritchard. He spoke carefully, with the hesitant politeness of someone who had discovered grief where he expected paperwork. His mother had recently died, and he had purchased what he believed was an available plot beside Clara's grave, because his mother had once been Clara's friend at church. He had gone to Willow Rest to approve the marker placement, and noticed Clara's name on the adjoining stone. Something about the records bothered him. He remembered seeing me leave flowers there on Fridays. He asked the cemetery office for clarification. They told him the adjacent plot had been legally transferred by the owner's family. He found my number through an old church directory. When he explained, I did not understand at first. The mind protects itself from certain information by refusing to arrange the words. Transferred, owner authorization, family representative, and sale completed, marker pending. Then Alan said the plot number, Section B, Row 12, Plot 19. My plot. I thanked him with a voice that did not sound like mine and called Willow Rest. The office manager, Helen Voss, had worked there for years and knew my face, if not my story. When I asked about the plot, she became quiet. She said there had been a transfer request with notarized documentation. She said my son had handled it. She said the records showed my consent. I told her I had given none. By the end of that afternoon, I was sitting in her office under fluorescent lights that made everything feel colder than it was, and she printed the form. I saw my name, Samuel R. Whitmore, signed at the bottom in a hand that tried to imitate mine. The signature was close enough to fool someone in a hurry and wrong enough to make my stomach turn. The S was too rounded, the W leaned left. Whoever forged it had copied the shape but not the pressure. A machinist notices pressure. The notary stamp belonged to a woman across town, and Helen looked shaken. She said Russell had come with Diane, saying I was recovering from a fall, and had asked them to help simplify arrangements. He had said I no longer wanted to be buried at Willow Rest because it was too painful. Diane had cried in the office. Helen had felt sorry for them. She admitted no one called me. I asked for copies of everything. Transfer form, payment record, visitor log, email correspondence, and cemetery map, internal notes, identification copies, the lot sale receipt, the date, the time, the amount, $27,000. That was what my children had sold my final place beside Clara for. Not a fortune, not enough to save a collapsing business, not enough to change a life, just enough to buy time on a debt and lose their father forever. I drove straight to the notary's address. I did not go inside. I sat across the street and called my attorney, Grace Harlan. Grace had helped Clara and me update our wills after her diagnosis. She was small, calm, and dangerous in the way a closed knife is dangerous. When I told her what happened, she asked me to say nothing to my children. She asked me to bring every document. She asked me whether Russell and Diane owed money. I said they owed everyone. Grace told me to come in the next morning. That night, I did not sleep. I made coffee at 2 a.m. and spread the cemetery papers across the kitchen table. I placed Clara's photograph beside them, the one from our 30th anniversary, where she wore a blue dress and looked at me like I was better than I was. I kept touching the forged signature, as if my finger could prove it was not me. By dawn, sadness had turned into structure. I made a list: cemetery office, notary, bank, business filings, loan records, text messages, prior payments, witnesses, dates, receipts. My children had treated my death as a piece of inventory. They had forgotten I spent my life reading small details before machines broke. Grace Harlan's office was above a bakery, which meant legal strategy always smelled faintly of cinnamon. She read the transfer form without speaking. Then she read it again. She asked if I had signed it. I said no. She asked if I had authorized anyone to sign for me. I said no. She asked if I wanted to pursue it as fraud. I said I wanted the truth tied to a brick so it could not float away. Grace smiled at that, but only a little. She began pulling threads. And first, the notary. Her name was Paula Redding. She had notarized the transfer based on identification presented by Russell and Diane. But when Grace requested the notary journal, the entry was suspicious. The signature line for me had been filled out. But there was no proper thumbprint, no direct contact note, and no clear evidence I had appeared in person. Paula claimed she had conducted a remote confirmation call. My phone records showed no such call. Then Grace obtained a copy of the number Paula had supposedly called. It was not mine. It belonged to a prepaid phone purchased the day before the transfer. Second, the money. The $27,000 from the plot sale had not gone to me. It had been routed to Whitmore Home Renewal as reimbursement for family estate expenses. That phrase was written on the memo line of the cashier's check: estate expenses. I was alive, but apparently my estate had already become useful. Third, the debt. Russell and Diane's company was deeper in trouble than I had known. Grace found 2 liens, 3 unpaid subcontractor claims, and a commercial line of credit at Summit County Cooperative Bank that was 90 days past due. The bank had been preparing to classify the loan as non-performing. The debt was secured by business equipment, receivables, and personal guarantees from Russell, Diane, Craig, and Marlene. They had used the cemetery money to make a partial payment, and not to solve the problem, but to delay embarrassment. Then Grace said something that changed the direction of everything. She said distressed business debt could sometimes be purchased or assigned if the lender wanted it off their books. I looked at her. She told me not to get ahead of myself. Buying debt was not revenge by itself, and it had to be done properly, through legal channels, with full disclosure and no harassment. But if the bank was willing to sell the note, a buyer could step into the lender's position. That buyer would have the right to enforce the terms, call defaults, require documentation, and negotiate repayment. My children had used my sacred ground to feed a failing business. I could use my savings to become the one person their business could no longer lie to. I did not decide that day. I drove to Willow Rest first. I stood beside Class's grave under the maple tree and looked at the empty grass that no longer belonged to me on paper. There was no marker yet, no sign of Alan Pritchard's mother, just grass, wind, and a betrayal invisible to anyone passing by. I told Clara I was sorry then. I told her I was not done. Over the next 2 weeks, Grace worked with a financial attorney named Malcolm Price, who handled note purchases and commercial debt. We did not storm into the bank. We did not threaten anyone. We gathered, we verified, we documented. Malcolm contacted Summit County Cooperative Bank through proper channels and learned that Whitmore Home Renewal's loan had become a problem the bank wanted resolved before quarter end. The bank did not want a family drama. It wanted certainty. I had certainty. A portion of my retirement savings sat in conservative investments. Clara and I had built over decades. Not flashy, not reckless. Money saved from overtime, unused vacations, careful living, and a small stock purchase that had grown quietly while everyone else chased bigger things. I had never wanted to use that money in conflict. Clara and I had saved it for security, medical care, and dignity. Dignity was exactly what this had become through Malcolm. I purchased the note at a discount. Not secretly in the sense of fraud, but quietly, legally, without announcing my name until the assignment was complete. Summit County Cooperative Bank transferred the debt to an entity Grace created for me. Maple. Rest Holdings. The name was mine. Maple for the tree above Clara. Rest for what my children tried to sell. When the papers were signed, I became the lawful holder of the debt that had been strangling their business. I did not feel powerful. I felt sad. Power without sadness can make a man cruel. Sadness kept me careful. Russell called 3 days after the assignment was recorded. His voice was bright and artificial. The way it sounded whenever he needed money but wanted to pretend he was offering an opportunity. He said the business had turned a corner. He said they had a buyer lined up for the renovated duplex. He said one more bridge loan would protect everyone. He said he hated asking, but family had to stand together. I let him talk. He did not mention the cemetery plot, neither did I. Diane called later that evening. She used a softer method. She said Russell was under terrible stress. She said Marlene was scared. She said the grandchildren might suffer if the business failed. She said Clara would not want a family to collapse over money. She did not say Clara would have wanted to be separated from her husband in death so a contractor could be paid late. I noticed that. I told Diane I needed time. She sounded relieved. People who believe they are manipulating you often mistake patience for weakness. Meanwhile, Grace filed a formal dispute with Willow Rest regarding the plot transfer. The cemetery froze any marker placement. Alan Pritchard, the man who had called me, turned out to be decent in a way that made the whole situation more painful. When he learned the transfer was contested, he withdrew his mother's placement request and apologized, though he had done nothing wrong. He said his mother would not have wanted to rest on stolen ground. I told him Clara would have liked her. The cemetery began its own review. Paula Redding, the notary, hired an attorney. Her journal entries did not match her story. The prepaid phone became a problem. The office camera at Willow Rest showed Russell and Diane present, but not me. Email records showed Marlene had sent scanned copies of my old driver's license, claiming she was helping with family planning. Craig had prepared the payment routing form, and everyone had touched the lie. As the investigation tightened, my children grew more aggressive without knowing why. Russell showed up at my house one afternoon and found the locks changed. And he looked offended, as if the key he carried was a birthright. Through the door, he said he needed to talk. I stepped onto the porch but did not invite him in. He asked why I was acting strange. He said people were noticing. He said Diane was hurt. He said family problems should stay inside the family. That is what guilty people often want. Privacy for the harm, publicity for the victim's reaction. I asked him about the cemetery plot. His face changed so quickly. I almost pitied him. Almost, he said they were going to tell me. He said it had been temporary. He said I could be buried somewhere else and Clara would understand. And he said dead was dead and the living had emergencies. Dead was dead. That sentence was worse than the forgery. The forgery had stolen property. That sentence tried to steal meaning. And I looked at my son and saw a man who had become so used to taking from me that even my grave looked negotiable. I did not argue. I told him all future conversations would go through Grace Harlan. And he laughed at that, but not confidently. He said lawyers would only make things worse. I told him things were already worse. Lawyers would make them documented. 2 days later, Maple Rest Holdings sent formal notice to Whitmore Home Renewal that the commercial note had been assigned and was in default. The letter requested financial records, proof of insurance, collateral documentation, receivables reports, and a cure plan within the required period under the loan terms. Russell called me within an hour. This time he was not bright, and he was afraid. The confrontation happened in the conference room at Grace Harlan's office, not in a courtroom, not at the cemetery, not in a screaming scene on my porch. Grace preferred rooms with tables, copies, witnesses, and doors that closed softly. She said truth did not need a stage if the documents were strong enough. Russell came with Marlene, Diane came with Craig, their attorney came too. A tired man named Leonard Voss, who looked as if he had already learned more than he wanted to know. Malcolm Price sat beside Grace. I sat at the end of the table with Clara's cemetery deed in front of me. And no one hugged. No one pretended. Grace began with the cemetery documents, the original purchase agreement from 31 years earlier, the receipt showing Clara and I paid for plots 18 and 19, and the map, the photograph of Clara's gravesite, the contested transfer form, my verified signature samples, phone records showing no notary call to me, the prepaid phone record, and Willow as visitor log, the security still showing Russell and Diane at the office, the payment trail showing $27,000 going to Whitmore Home Renewal with each page. Diane folded smaller into her chair. Russell stared at the table. Craig looked at the ceiling. Marlene kept her arms crossed until Grace placed the email she had sent with my driver's license copy in front of her. And then her arms slowly came down. Their attorney asked for a moment. Grace gave him one. He whispered to them. Russell shook his head. Diane began crying. Marlene whispered back angrily, and Craig said nothing. Then Malcolm opened the second folder. He explained that Maple Rest Holdings was now the lawful holder of the Whitmore Home Renewal commercial note. He provided the assignment agreement, and the loan documents, the default history, the collateral list, and the personal guarantees. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Numbers are their own weather. Everyone in that room felt the temperature drop, and Russell looked at me then with betrayal on his face. That almost made me laugh. He looked betrayed because the father he had defrauded had become the creditor he could not charm. He said I had bought their debt to destroy them. Grace told him not to make accusations he could not support. I spoke then quietly. I said they had sold my burial place to delay a debt they did not tell me about. I said I purchased the debt legally because I no longer trusted them to tell the truth about money, property, signatures, or family. I said destruction was not my goal. Accountability was. Diane said they had panicked. She said the business would have failed. She said they were trying to save everything. I told her people do not save a family by selling their father's grave. There it was. The sentence that finally made her stop talking. Marlene tried to shift blame. She said it was just a plot and I was still alive, and nothing permanent had happened. Grace slid the cemetery transfer approval across the table and reminded her that a third party had nearly placed another woman beside my wife because of their actions. Permanent had come closer than they wanted to admit, and Craig asked what I wanted. That was the first practical question anyone had asked. I told them what I wanted. First, full cooperation in reversing the cemetery transfer and restoring Plot 19 to my name. And second, reimbursement of every legal, administrative, and investigative cost tied to the fraud. Third, a formal written admission that I had not authorized the transfer. Fourth, and return of all copies of my identification and personal documents. Fifth, a structured repayment plan on the business debt with strict oversight. No more hidden borrowing, no more use of the Whitmore name in marketing without my approval. and no distributions to family owners until legitimate vendors and required payments were current. Sixth, Diane and Russell would be removed from every role in my estate medical directive and financial backup documents. Seventh, any future contact involving money would go through Grace. Russell said that would humiliate them. I said selling my grave had already done that. And the difference was that now the truth would be standing in the room with us. Their attorney advised them to settle. I could see it on his face before he said the words. He knew what the documents meant. And he knew forgery, elder financial exploitation, fraudulent transfer, and misuse of business funds were not words any client wanted near a judge. By the end of that meeting, nobody had won, but the lying had stopped. That was enough for one day. The consequences came in layers. The cemetery transfer was reversed first. Alan Pritchard's family received a different plot at no extra cost. And Willow Rest issued a written apology for failing to verify my consent properly. Paula Redding's notary commission came under review, the prepaid phone, the false call entry, and the transfer documents were forwarded to the appropriate authorities. I did not follow every detail after that. I did not need to watch each person fall. It was enough that the ground beside Clara returned to my name, and the day Helen Voss called to confirm it. I drove to Willow Rest with yellow tulips. I stood at plot 19 for nearly an hour. Nothing visible had changed. Grass still moved in the wind, and the maple still leaned over Clara's stone. Cars still passed on the road beyond the fence, but to me the air felt different. Restored ground has a silence of its own. I placed one tulip on Clara's grave and one on mine, and then I went home. Whitmore home renewal did not collapse, but it stopped pretending. Under the repayment agreement, Russell and Diane had to provide monthly financial records, and vendor payments were prioritized. Owner draws were suspended. Craig's advertising budget was cut. Marlene had to remove videos claiming the company was built entirely from their independent success, and that part bothered her more than the money. Some people can lose dollars more easily than image. The business survived only after they sold 2 properties at lower profits and liquidated equipment they had no business buying in the first place. Russell sold his boat. Craig sold a luxury SUV. Diane cashed out a vacation fund. Marlene returned furniture purchased during a month when subcontractors had gone unpaid. They called these sacrifices. I called them delayed honesty. The personal consequences were harder. I changed my will, not in anger, though anger sat nearby. I removed Russell and Diane from all authority over my affairs. I placed the house and savings into a structure Grace helped me create. With professional oversight and strict protections, my grandchildren would still be cared for through education funds, and no adult child would receive direct control over anything while I lived. A portion of my estate would go to the Clara Whitmore Memorial Apprenticeship Fund for young people entering skilled trades, and especially those who could not afford tools, certification fees, or transportation. That decision gave me more peace than I expected. For 40 years, my hands had earned what my children tried to treat as inevitable, and helping young workers buy their first tool sets felt cleaner than leaving money to adults who had sold sacred ground because they could not control spending. Russell did not speak to me for 3 months, and then he came to Willow Rest one Friday morning. I saw his truck pull in and almost left, but Clara had taught me not to run from hard things when standing still would tell the truth better. And he walked up without flowers. His eyes were red. He looked at his mother's stone, and then at the empty space beside it. For a long time, he said nothing then. He admitted he had told himself I would never really know. And he admitted that made it worse. He admitted he had started thinking of my things as future assets instead of present ownership. He said he was sorry, but the apology still had too much hunger in it, as if he wanted forgiveness to cancel consequence. I told him I loved him. Then I told him love did not restore his access. He nodded like he understood, though I knew he did not fully. And people who benefit from soft boundaries often call firm ones cruelty until time teaches them another language. Diane came later. Alone, she brought Clara's favorite tea, which almost made me angry because grief should not be used as decoration. But she did not mention the tea. She sat at my kitchen table and cried without asking me to comfort her. That was new. She said she had heard Marlene call the plot just a piece of grass and had known it was wrong but wanted the business saved more than she wanted to be brave. She said she had confused fear with necessity, and that was an honest sentence. I told her courage would have cost less. She covered her face with both hands. I did not reach across the table right away. A father hand can become another way of erasing consequences if it arrives too soon, and so I let the silence do its work. Then, after a while, I poured the tea. A year after the plot was restored, I attended the first award ceremony for the Clara Whitmore Memorial Apprenticeship Fund, and it was held in a community college workshop that smelled of oil, sawdust, hot metal, and young nerves. 5 students received tool grants that day. One wanted to become a welder. And one wanted VAC certification. One wanted to work in precision machining like I had. A young woman named Alana cried when she opened the box containing her starter calipers, micrometers, and safety glasses, and work boots. She said her grandfather had been a machinist and she wished he could see her. I told her maybe he could, on the drive home. I felt Clara beside me in the passenger seat the way I sometimes do when the light is soft and the road is familiar. Not as a ghost, not exactly, more like a memory with warmth still in it. And I told her the money had gone somewhere good. I told her the maple tree looked healthy. I told her Russell was trying, Diane was trying harder, and I was trying not to turn pain into stone. And trying matters. People like clean endings. They want the bad children punished, the good father vindicated, the money recovered, the grave restored, the family either healed or cut away completely. And real life is less tidy. Russell is still my son. Diane is still my daughter. They did a terrible thing. They also carry pieces of Clara in their faces, their hands, their laughter when it comes honestly. I cannot erase either truth to make the story easier, so I live with boundaries. Russell visits once a month now, usually at the workshop where we repair donated tools for apprenticeship students. And at first he came because Grace wrote community restitution into one of the agreements. Later he kept coming after the required hours ended. He is quieter there. Metal does not care about charm. A dull blade is dull, a crooked cut is crooked. A man either corrects his work or ruins the piece. I think that has been good for him. Diane comes on Sundays sometimes. She brings groceries and does not open drawers. And she asks before touching Clara's things. That sounds small. But after a betrayal involving signatures, documents, and sacred ground, asking permission becomes a form of respect. And we are rebuilding slowly with fewer assumptions and more locked cabinets. It is not the family Clara dreamed of, but it is more honest than the family that sat in my living room asking me to sell my piece. Marlene remains distant. Craig is polite in the stiff way of men who dislike consequences but prefer them to courtrooms. That is fine. Not every relationship needs repair. Some only need distance. I still go to Willow Rest every Friday. The staff knows me better now. Helen Voss always nods when she sees my truck. Plot 19 is back in my name, recorded properly, protected twice over, and with copies in Grace S. office, my fireproof box, and the cemetery vault. It may seem excessive to some people. Those people have never seen their own grave sold by their children. I kneel less often now because my knee is worse, but I still clean around Clara S. Stone. I still bring yellow tulips. I still speak to her. Sometimes I tell her about the apprenticeship students. Sometimes I tell her about Diane's progress. Sometimes I tell her nothing at all and let the wind move through the maple leaves. One Friday in October, when the tree had turned the exact gold Clara loved, I stood between her grave and my empty plot. The sunlight fell across both spaces evenly. For the first time in a long while, I did not feel like death was waiting there. I felt like a promise had been defended. And that is different. I know my children thought I was too sentimental. Maybe I am. Sentiment is what keeps a man from becoming only muscle, money, and paperwork. Sentiment is why a cemetery plot can be more than land. Why a yellow tulip can be more than a flower. Why a tool with a worn handle can hold the shape of a lifetime. Why a father can still love children who hurt him, but not allow them to keep holding the knife. They sold my cemetery plot because they believed I was old enough to be managed, lonely enough to be manipulated, and soft enough to forgive before the ink dried. They misjudged me. I did forgive some things in time. I forgave fear, I forgave panic, I forgave weakness where it turned into honest repair, but I did not forgive forgery by pretending it was a misunderstanding. I did not forgive greed by financing it. I did not forgive disrespect by leaving the door unlocked for more. The debt is still being paid. The business is smaller now, but cleaner. The apprenticeship fund grows each year. My house is quieter but safer. Clara's grave is peaceful again. The empty plot beside her remains empty, waiting for me, not as property to be traded, but as the final page of a promise we wrote together long before our children learned the price of things and forgot the value. When my time comes, I will rest beside my wife under the maple tree she chose. And not because a court allowed it, not because my children approved it, because love paid for that ground, truth defended it, and dignity put my name back where it belonged.